Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs, and as you can see, I'm still down at the beach. Not very busy here yet, but I'm sure it will be. It's still quite early, but it's an absolute scorcher today, you'll be pleased to hear. And the reason I wanted to post this video is to talk about the Russian shadow tanker fleet. And this is a fleet of around 600 vessels that are transporting Russian oil to avoid the sanctions. And I'm going to put this camera down so that it's not as shaky, because a few people were complaining that it was a bit shaky and they didn't like all the movements. But you can still hear the sound of the sea behind me, so hopefully that gives you that holiday vibe whilst I'm talking to you about what's happening in Russia. And we've had a recent development in terms of the shadow fleet. So basically these 600 tankers are often unregistered, or you don't know exactly who the owner is. It's very difficult to be able to establish the ownership trail. Some of them don't have any insurance, or if they do, they have very minimal insurance. They're often very old vessels, so the average age of a tanker is around 15 years. The lifespan is seen to be around 20. Some of these tankers are more than 30 years old. They're not very well maintained, and all of that means that potentially you're looking at an environmental disaster. If one of these tankers has an accident or breaches its load and leaks lots of oil into the sea, then potentially you've got a major problem, a big cleanup operation. And if you don't have any insurance, obviously then nobody's going to foot the bill for that, apart from whosever waters it's in. And Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister of the UK, has now announced that there's going to be a crackdown on this fleet of tankers. At a meeting of 46 European countries, they agreed that they are now going to start policing their waters. So basically what that means is that if you're a shadow tanker, so you might not be registered, you might not have your transponder on, so nobody can actually track where you are, and you're carrying Russian cargo, you can be stopped and then arrested and taken to the nearest port. And this is basically going to stop these shadow tankers from being able to move through all of the different waters. And the reason why this is important is because of what's happening with Russian oil. So the oil price caps that were brought in around 18 months ago set a limit of $60 per barrel for crude oil, for Russian crude oil, and around $100 for refined products. So that's basically gasoline, diesel, kerosene, all of those sorts of things. And if you're a tanker that is either owned by the West or insured by the West, you have to have documentation that proves that the cargo that you're traveling with has been sold for less than those levels. And that basically is limiting the amount of revenue that Russia can earn. But the problem that we've had over the last 18 months is that there's been a bit of a bending of the rules. So transportation costs, which are over and above the actual price being paid for the oil, can be added on top. So there's been a lot of investigation as to whether or not the transportation costs were actually valid. Were they actually real, or was this just a way of giving Russia more revenue? So there's been a number of different investigations into how to police this actual cap. But the biggest issue is now the 600 tankers that are moving 1.7 million barrels of oil per day. And when you annualize that, if you take the average price of a Russian barrel of oil, which is currently sitting at just under $80, that equates to $50 billion per year that Russia is still earning as a result of this shadow fleet moving all of this oil. Now you might be sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, didn't you just say that the price cap was $60? How come Russia is selling its oil for $80 per barrel? Well, the reason for that is multiple. Firstly, Russia does have its own fleet of some tankers, but relatively small. Only around 10% of Russia's oil is moved by tankers owned by Russia. The West owns the vast majority of the tankers that are moving oil around the world, and at the start of the war in Ukraine, it was estimated that around 80 to 90% of Russian oil was being moved by tankers either owned by the West or insured by the West. However, that figure has now dropped to around 30%. So what that means is that 70% of all of the oil coming out of Russia is being moved by ships that are not owned by the West. Only 10% of those are owned by Russia. So that means that the balance, which is a massive 60%, is coming from these shadowed fleets, and then maybe some tankers that are owned also by China and some of the other countries that are not applying sanctions against Russia. So the West really needs to clamp down on this shadow trading. And this initiative that's now been announced to start policing the waters stronger is the first step to really closing down the revenue that Russia is still earning from the sale of its oil, despite the fact that there are all these sanctions in place. And the shadow fleet is really one of the key drivers as to how Russia has managed to bypass those rules. So the fact that Keir Starmer has pulled together all of the European countries and said we now need to start policing all of our waters much stronger is the first step to closing down a further $50 billion of revenue from Russia's perspective. And obviously, from the Russian economy point of view, that's going to really hurt Russia because oil still remains as the heartbeat of Russian revenue. It's the most important form of income that it gets. And if the West can close down these shadow fleets, then obviously that's going to be good from that perspective. But there's also another benefit because from an environmental point of view, as I mentioned, a lot of these tankers are not insured. And that means that if we do have a disaster, there's nobody there to pick up the cleanup costs. And because these tankers are old and not being run by experienced crew, there is a really high risk that some sort of disaster will occur and that won't be insured. Now I'm going to stand up now because my knees are hurting. Kneeling down on the sand might be fun for toddlers, but it's not so much if you're my sort of age. So I'll have a quick walk and talk to finish off the video. So what we've got here is a really good development in terms of trying to close down Russia's remaining largest income stream. Those shadow tankers are still operating on a daily basis. 1.7 million barrels of oil is a lot of oil that's being transported. And many of those tankers are doing what's called ship-to-ship transfers, where basically they pick up the cargo from Russia, they then sail out into waters and then meet another ship, which might be officially registered and insured by the West, and they then transport that oil over onto the new ship, and then that ship can then sail into the waters because it's very difficult to be able to establish where oil came from. It doesn't have any labels on it. You can't check to see whether it's Russian oil or coming from the West. It's oil is oil, basically. So closing down these routes for the shadow tankers is going to be a key way of closing down income from Russia's point of view. And one of the other issues that's been identified is that some of this shadow fleet are potentially involved in surveillance. So they've been listening in on other ships and what's been going on in terms of maritime discussions to try to pick up surveillance for Russia in terms of providing intelligence to its military. So closing down on this shadow fleet, it will close down on Russia's finances. It will also help to reduce the potential for an environmental disaster and potentially also cuts out the surveillance that these ships are doing. So I think this is really a positive development in terms of trying to bring the war in Ukraine to some sort of conclusion, because if you can cut off the revenue that Russia is earning from oil, then that's going to be the most likely way that Russia will come around the table and try to negotiate some form of peace settlement. Whether or not that's acceptable to Ukraine remains to be seen. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. You've found it a bit more fun being down at the beach. I'll show you what's going on. It's still pretty empty down here. There are some people out and about on bikes, riding around, but not too many. Still quite early in the morning, but it is really, really hot. So hopefully you've enjoyed Joe Blogs on Location. Let me know what you think, whether or not you like this format, because I might try to introduce it when I do get back. I think going out and about is probably a bit more fun, a bit more interesting than me just sitting, talking, looking at graphs the whole time. I can introduce a quick graph here if you like. Let's have a look at what's gone on with regards to Russian oil prices, because I think that is something that really is quite interesting. If we look here, you can see that the average price that Urals oil has been trading at recently is just under $80 per barrel. And that compares to around $85 for Brent crude oil. So only a $5 difference. And when the war first started, we were talking a 20 to 30% difference. So basically we would have had a difference of somewhere between $20 and $30 at that point. Today it's only $5. And one of the reasons for that is because Russia is managing to bypass the sanctions with this shadow tanker fleet that is now being closed down upon. So there you go. I've thrown in a graph for today just to keep everybody who loves graphs happy. But hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Slightly different, slightly more fun. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you again on the next episode.